My name's Kate Kelly. I'm the program manager for LCA, and we are a nonprofit watershed protection organization that was begun in 1990. Our mission is to protect, maintain, and restore ecological health while promoting social values that support sustainable community development in the Middle Lake Champlain region of Vermont. And so we've begun sort of a new initiative, and we've been having a series of talks and discussions surrounding carbon and carbon storage. And so tonight we've invited Ethan Tapper to join us, who is our Chittenden County Forester, to talk about carbon and forests and forestry. Um, and I think with that, we can kick it off. So, Ethan, take it away.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So my name is Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. I work for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And because I was here, I don't know, last month or
Yeah.
something like that, I'm not going to do the whole thing. And also because I'm about to try and explain like the most complex thing ever in 30 minutes. So I am just going to dive right into it. And then I think we'll have some time for questions after the presentation.
Yep. Yeah, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions, excuse me.
Great. So I am just going to start going. All right. You guys all see that?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So we're going to focus on a lot of different things. I want to talk about managing forests and the interplay between managing forests and forest carbon and climate change. And then also I want to bring into it, I know folks at Lewis Creek Association have been interested in how do we manage for carbon and how do we manage for a changing climate and climate change mitigation while also within the current use program, the use value appraisal program, which is a really important tax abatement program that helps our lands be conserved and protected and also managed responsibly, we hope. And we think that, I know that we can do really great carbon focused management within current use. And I just want to touch on that a little bit as well. But just in the basics here, so the carbon cycle is basically, this is again, all this stuff is going to be a massive oversimplification of everything we're talking about. It's all really, really nuanced, so just bear with me, please. So the carbon cycle is, the cycle that really is the foundation of all life on our planet. So it's the way that plants fix aerial carbon through the process of photosynthesis and turn it into tissue. They turn it into sugars, they make it into stuff. It gets broken down, it becomes organic carbon, a complex carbon, and eventually that carbon is broken down by bacteria and a bunch of other stuff, respires into the air and becomes carbon gas again, right? So one of the interesting things to think about carbon, when we talk about carbon, a lot of times we're sucked into this idea of thinking about it as this like shapeless, like it's some sort of inert chemical that, we don't know what it looks like. In reality, carbon is like plant tissue. And not only is it just sort of inertly in the soil, but it also has function. So carbon in our soils is wildlife habitat for all the little things that make our world work, like fungi and invertebrates, salamanders, stuff like that, and a number of different other organisms, vertebrate organisms. And it also helps our forest build soil and fertility that is then taken up into plant life and trees and ultimately animals. And it also has hydrologic benefits and a whole bunch of other benefits. So it has substance, and it's much more than just sort of this inert chemical. And the way it interacts with all the organisms on Earth is really complex. So in Vermont, most of our carbon, and this is from forest inventory and analysis data from Vermont from 2017, only 33% of forest carbon in our forests is in living trees. So most of it is and only 28% of it is in living trees above ground. So the vast majority of it is in the soil and in dead trees and in below ground portions of trees. So that's really important to know as well. We always think about these trees are huge, and they must be holding all that carbon in the trunks of the trees, but that's actually not the case. So this is a really cool graphic from a 2019 paper or booklet, really, by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro that they call a forest succession and development clock. And if you'll bear with me, so this clock is showing a few different things. So it's really important that we separate the idea of carbon sequestration and the idea of carbon storage. So the rate at which a forest is sequestering carbon is the rate at which it's grabbing carbon out of the air. The rate at which a forest is storing carbon, or the amount of carbon stored in a forest, is the total carbon that's in there, that's fixed in there. And again, most of that is usually in the soils. So what you see here is, we don't need to worry about this yellow circle here. Let's start with this green one. So this green circle is showing the rate at which forests are sequestering carbon as they develop. So this is not trees, this is forests as systems. And it's showing it on this clock starting at year 0. And the darker this color green is, the more carbon that forest is sequestering. So, here at year 0, let's say it's after a clear cut, or let's say it's after some big disturbance event, it's sequestering very little carbon. Here at year 30 through really like year 70, year 80 is really, really intense carbon sequestration. And so that's when you have this young forest, it's growing really, really fast, and it's pulling a lot of carbon out of the air, right? Now, for a long time, this has been sort of a dog whistle to the forest, to the industrial forest management industry, because they're like, oh, don't we want to sequester carbon? Let's clear cut our forests. And then the young forests are going to grow really fast and they're going to pull all this carbon out of the air. That's great. So that can be good, but what that's not accounting for is the fact that we also really want to store a lot of carbon in our forests. And so for a variety of different reasons, when you clear cut a forest, or when there's a large scale disturbance event, here at year 0, you are storing very little carbon. And that forest continues to store carbon as it develops here into the future. So as you can see, it's just adding carbon, adding carbon, adding carbon, adding carbon. And then a big large scale disturbance event comes along and a lot of that carbon is released. So it's important to know the difference between those two things. So while a young forest sequesters carbon very quickly, it's not necessarily storing as much carbon as an older forest. So this is a graphic that is really, really important. Oh, I'm just going to move this around. Oh, this is a graphic that's really, really important, and you're going to see it a lot. And the reason you're going to see it is because it's just sort of being, this is a paper from 2009 by Jared Nunnery and Bill Keaton. And what this illustrates is the amount of above ground carbon sequestered by forests based on different types of treatments. So a treatment is the way that we manage the forest. And as you can see here, this red line, which is a no management scenario, is in above ground carbon is sequestering the most carbon. And then you have all these other clear cut, high frequency, clear cut, low frequency, shelter wood. These are just different silvicultural techniques, ways that people manage forests that you don't need to know what these are. But what you do need to know is that here we go at a no management scenario, we have the most carbon being sequestered. What you need to understand what this graphic really means is a few different things. So number one, this is not total carbon in the system. This is carbon sequestered, not stored, and it's just above ground carbon. The other thing is that this is a model which assumes, number one, no natural disturbances. So natural disturbances are a pretty big deal in the forest. So this is assuming, though, just for the sake of comparison, no natural disturbances. Number two, constant climate, which we know we don't have. Number three, stable carbon storage, stable soil carbon storage. So it's not considering many of the qualitative variables, which also are going to lend a lot of complexity to when we think about how we manage our forests, nor is it considering stuff like the benefits of replacing, say, non-renewable resources with renewable resources from forests, or replacing non-local resources with local resources, stuff like that. So this is a really, really important graphic for you to understand, but you should also know it, have some context for what that means. So as we think about this, as you know, why is it important to manage our forests so that they're sequestering and storing carbon? So climate change is really, really important, and it's an intrinsic and existential threat to like so much stuff that we care about. But when most of us, you know, in the forest management, the ecology related fields talk about climate change, we actually have started using the term global change. So global change is a term that's meant to reflect a larger idea of the volume of stressors and challenges that are posed across our landscape, which is certainly climate change is a big one of those, but it's certainly not all of them. So global change is climate change plus all these other stressors, including the legacy of past land clearing and the way that forests have been mismanaged in the past and other ecosystems have been mismanaged, invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, pathogens, what are sometimes called biological invasions, ongoing forest loss, conversion, fragmentation into small pieces, pollution, environmental despoliation, global loss of biodiversity, mass extinction, stuff like this. And so this is a better reflection rather than just thinking about climate change as the, you know, because it's such a huge threat as being the only threat, thinking about a more holistic view of what we're really facing and what our ecosystems are really facing is really, really important. And so as we manage our forests, we need to manage them in a way that's not just, you know, maximum carbon necessarily in every situation, although we need to manage them for more carbon sequestration and storage because we want to mitigate the climate change part of this equation. But we also have to manage forests which are adaptive, which are resilient, and which are able to cope with this massive array of stressors that are coming down the pike. So there's a whole bunch of different effects that climate change has on forests. It's going to alter our natural disturbance. It is altering our natural disturbance regimes, altering the suitable ranges for our native species of trees and animals. If basically what you can think about this is it's increasing stress, right? Because our trees aren't, as soon as their suitable ranges are altered, you know, sugar maple isn't all going to die here all at once. It's just going to become the climate here is just going to become less and less hospitable for it, which is going to be really, really stressful. And so you can think about this as sort of a volume of stress and then add to that all this other stuff. So we in sort of the ecological forest management community have traded the idea of stability, the idea that of a forest that resists change, for resilience. And this is a recognition of the fact that forests change, they have to change, they're changing all the time, right? And we want to manage forests that are able to change while remaining healthy. So in the long term, resilient forests are going to sequester and store more carbon because they're going to be buffered from large-scale disturbances and large-scale problems that are going to threaten their ability to function as ecosystems. So that's really, really important. From another resource by Tony D'Amato and Paul Cannizzaro from 2016, which is also really great, Increasing Forest Resiliency for an Uncertain Future. They lay out these 4 goals. So goal number 1, keep forests forested and connected. Goal number 2, reduce stressors, limit the amount of stress that forests face in order to increase forest vigor. Goal number 3, reduce vulnerability. So make forests more resilient by establishing complex structure. We're going to talk about what that means and reducing forest disturbances. Goal number 4, provide refuge. So maintain plant and animal diversity over time. So in addition to managing forests which are resilient, we also need to manage forests which are adaptive. So, you know, I'm sort of like obsessed with old growth forests. I love that they show us, you know, how forests are supposed to grow because so many of our forests across our landscape are so altered. But you have to sort of take that with a grain of salt because the environment, the conditions that in the world that we're managing our forests for now, the forest of the future is going to be entirely different than the forest of 300 years ago because our climate is so altered and our world is so altered. So we want to manage forests which are able to adapt to and change in a wide variety of potential future conditions. And what this looks like, same thing as managing for resilient forests, what this means is we want to maintain a lot of diversity. So we want a diversity of different species, we want a diversity of different sizes and ages of trees, and we want to manage stressors across our landscape. So I figured I'd put in a picture of the stream because Lewis Creek Association's somewhat stream focused. I know much broader than that. But I think about sometimes the role of potential management being a carbon asset as, I attended a meeting years ago. I attended a meeting of stream folks, and they were talking about helping streams achieve a state of equilibrium. So streams that have been ditched and straightened, you want them to be able to restore their natural meanders. And in that state, they're going to be more stable, more resilient, less erosive, because they will sort of just be more in this resilient condition. Forests can be a little bit like that. So there may be conditions where, in order to manage our forests for an uncertain future, to actively make them more diverse and more resilient sooner than they'd be able to naturally, that we need to do some management. That management leads to the release of carbon, just like this stream restoring its natural meanders leads to a little bit of erosion, in order to get into a condition that's going to buffer it from large-scale disturbances and large-scale releases of carbon in the future. It's not something that we need to do on every acre, but it is something that can have some benefits to our forests, which our climate is changing so much faster that we may need to help our forests adapt to these conditions because they can't respond to them fast enough on their own. The other thing that we need to think about is that, when you start thinking about like how scary climate change is and what an existential threat it is to our ecosystems and all the things we care about, it's easy to lose track of the quality. So the quantity is carbon. So forests can sequester and store a lot of carbon. The quality is the goal of mitigating climate change and the goal of protecting our planet is not just to, mitigate this one thing. We want to create a world which is more functional, right? We want ecological integrity. We want wildlife habitat. And at the same time that our ecosystems are under this tremendous amount of stress, so are the non-tree biological organisms that are associated with them, right? So we need to be thinking about managing across our landscape for not just carbon, but also all the things. So all the habitats, all of the species, and our biodiversity, which is so important to us. So biodiversity is something that is precious. It is severely threatened by global change. And when you look at the statistics about where we are, we're in the middle of a mass extinction event. Where we are with biodiversity, it's sobering, right? So according to some sources, 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction. More than 40% of our amphibians, a third of our reef-forming corals, a third of our marine mammals are threatened. We've lost I think it's 680 vertebrate species in the last 300 years, and perhaps as many as 100,000 invertebrate species. We don't really know. So biodiversity is important because organisms have the right to exist. They have intrinsic importance, I would argue. And it's important because biodiversity, that diversity, remember, is a tool that allows our forests to be resilient and to be adaptive in a changing climate. Protecting biodiversity may require us to use tools that don't necessarily optimize forest carbon. So an example of that is we have this incredibly altered landscape. We don't have the diversity of habitats across our landscape that we would have had prior to European colonization. They just haven't had time to develop. And so if we want to protect communities of organisms, we may need to create those habitats actively. And, in the case of like creating a pocket of young forest, that is not a strategy that's going to sequester a lot of carbon, but it might, and in fact, it is going to cause the release of carbon, but it might be something that we want to do to protect our biodiversity, which is, again, not a quantitative benefit, but a qualitative benefit. I would argue also, though, that it has feedbacks into our ability to sequester and store carbon, because our biodiversity is what keeps our ecosystems chugging. And our ecosystems chugging along, in the case of Vermont, our forests are going to, if we have healthy, diverse ecosystems, they're going to be more able to sequester and store carbon into the future. Okay, so total left-hand turn. now we're talking about a government program called the Use Value Appraisal, UVA or current use. This is, a lot of us county foresters, this is what we spend like most of our time on because it's a really, really important program. So it's a tax abatement program for forested and agricultural lands in Vermont. Here's some excerpts from the UVA manual. Basically, if you're in the forested part of this program, you need 25 acres. You need a forest management plan developed by a licensed professional forester, which is reviewed by the county forester, me, in the case of Chittenden County, who also monitors it. And you got to follow the plan. And in exchange, you get, essentially, you pay less taxes on that land because it's being assessed at not its full fair market value, but its use value. The benefit of this is that we hope that it lowers tax pressure on landowners, so people aren't being taxed off their land, and that land is, it's decreasing subdivision and development pressure, and that land is being managed better because it's being managed with a professional approach. And, you know, held to certain standards, and subject to some review by the county foresters. So what it says about forest management is, while many different landowner objectives may be achieved through active forest management, production of high quality forest products on a sustainable basis shall be the primary focus of management efforts on all enrolled parcels of forest land. That's from the UVA manual. There are exceptions to this. So exceptions to this are the ESTAs, what we call, their full name is the ecologically significant treatment areas, which are managed for not forest products, but for water quality, wildlife habitat, and other non-commercial benefits. And some of the ESTAs that are eligible for in the current use program include natural communities of statewide significance, so rare natural communities, rare, threatened, and endangered species, riparian areas, so areas that are adjacent to, you know, that have some water quality benefit that are adjacent to water, surface waters, vernal pools, forested wetlands, and old forests. The old forest thing is pretty weird, and we can talk about it later. But basically, that's not for an area that right now, that's not for an area that you can just put land in it and let it become old forest. It's in recognition of a forest that's already old. So we can talk about that later in the questions if you want. Managing for, quote, high quality forest products can be completely compatible with managing for forest carbon. And actually, within most forest carbon markets, there's a series of practices that's called improved forest management, or IFM, which is allowed within these practices. It doesn't mean that every tree on your forest needs to get harvested, or that, you know, when it gets to be a certain age, or that everything is getting clear cut. It just means that the land needs to be actively managed in some way, in a way that's ostensibly for the future, current or future production of forest products. So an example of how forest management cannot be like the forest management of your nightmares is through practices like ecological forest management. So ecological forestry is the radical idea, I put radical in air quotes, that we manage forests like they manage themselves, right? That we're recognizing that they have intrinsic importance, and we're managing them as complex systems, not just as like tree farms, although, you know, sometimes we'll call them tree farms, but managing them as complex systems which are not limited to trees, right? So it's this whole volume of life, not just like I'm growing this tree to be a saw timber, a stick of saw timber, and when it gets to be 18 inches in diameter, I'm going to cut it and send it to the mill. It's a much more holistic approach. And it's recognizing the importance of not just trees, but all the organisms and all the natural processes that make forests work. So how we can manage for forest carbon in an individual forest, we can do a bunch of different things. So one thing is increasing rotation age, so letting trees get older, leaving big trees. So in the work that I do, I leave lots of what I call biological legacy trees, or legacy trees, which are ostensibly just, they're trees that are being managed not for timber, that are allowed to become big and old and confer to the forest the many ecological benefits of being big trees, and eventually to be big dead trees. We're leaving tons of dead wood on the forest floor, and trying to increase the resiliency and the adaptability of those systems. So again, recognizing that the sequestration and storage ability of a forest hinges on its ability to be resilient and its ability to be adaptive. And if we can do forest management that is increasing diversity and complexity, so doing stuff like supporting a healthy mix of different species, supporting multi-aged forests, forests which are more like old growth forests in that they're not just all trees that are the same age, but are more complex and diverse, that have structural diversity. And by addressing forest health threats like invasive plants, deer overpopulation, stuff like that, those are all things that are going to help our forests sequester and store lots of carbon in the long term. The other thing that we can do is avoid larger canopy openings like, big clear cuts, except in case we're trying to create some like very particular wildlife habitat that is not appropriate in every situation, but may be appropriate in certain situations for certain species. So one of the things that we can do by managing in this way and by keeping those structures, deadwood, longer rotations, leaving big trees, leaving dead trees, leaving deadwood on the forest floor, is that we can capture many of the ecological indicator species which are associated with old growth forests, which are these incredible repositories of biodiversity, right? So we can't create old growth forests, but we can make our forests old growthier. And we can look to old growth forests for lessons for how we manage our forests so that we're, really trying to capture the whole diverse range of different organisms that are utilizing these areas, and also hopefully their ability to sequester and store carbon and to mitigate the many stressors of climate change. So if you look into the literature, what you see is that there's these ecological indicator species that are associated with old growth. They include salamanders, which are largely associated with dead wood and with gaps in the forest canopy. Mosses, lichens, other bryophytes, liverworts, they're associated with dead wood, big old trees, smaller rather than larger canopy openings. Bark foraging birds like brown creeper and our nuthatches are associated with big old trees that have complex bark and complex canopies that they can forage for the tiny little invertebrates that they hunt for. Bird species diversity, so managing for different sizes, ages, and species of tree is going to capture a huge volume of different ecological niches which are occupied by a wide range of our different native birds, and fungi commonly associated with these old growth forests. If we're leaving dead wood, which is habitat for fungi, and also big old trees, which have been shown to serve as hubs and these underground, wood wide web, these underground fungal networks that are connecting trees, helping them extract resources from their environment, and also sometimes passing communication signals and stuff like that between them. We can capture, we can't make old growth forests, but we can capture many of the benefits of old growth forests and their attendant biodiversity by managing our forests in a slightly different way. So I think, managing our forest carbon across the landscape, by far, I would say a bigger threat to our forests, especially where I am, a bigger threat to our forests than climate change is forest loss. So Vermont loses 1,500 acres of forest a year, we think, mostly to development. And why that's scarier than climate change in some respects is that every one of those acres will never sequester and store carbon again. So that is, it'll never provide wildlife habitat, and it may diminish the ability of wildlife to access certain habitats as it fragments our landscape. And that's pretty much permanent. And so avoiding deforestation, forest fragmentation, parcelization through conservation and smart planning and zoning, it doesn't mean that we can't build any more houses, but it may mean that we need to really think about where we put them and clustering them in areas that are already developed and already fragmented, increasing the density with which we're developing in our communities, and avoiding developing in larger forested blocks is really, really important. And so as we're thinking about, broadening, so managing for landscapes that are going to store a lot of carbon and also that are ecologically healthy in a broader sense, we need to think about managing young forests, young simple forests, which is most forests on our landscape, to be more resilient, diverse, and complex. Creating pockets perhaps of habitat underrepresented across our landscape in order to protect our native biodiversity, which is going to be under and is under so much stress. Allowing some forests to be unmanaged. So if anyone tells you that the concept of a forest being unmanaged is an existential threat to forest management, they're just not being creative. right? Because almost every one of us who loves forests and believes in forest management also believes strongly in the idea of protecting unmanaged forests across our landscape. We love them. We want them to be here. That's really, really important. At the same time, that it doesn't answer all of our questions. It doesn't provide all the things that we need, but it provides a bunch of them that are really, really important that cannot be ignored. And also addressing landscape level threats like invasive exotic plants, insects, pests, pathogens, deer overpopulation, forest loss, conversion, fragmentation, parcelization, and who knows what else coming down the pike. So we need to make our land, in addition to making our forests more resilient, we need to make our landscapes more resilient and functional. And the last thing I'll say, this is like the weirdest thing, but thinking about, challenging all of us to think about where our resources come from. And if we're saying, we don't like forest management, we don't like resource production in our communities, but we're still consuming resources, think about where those resources are coming from. I think it is radical to think about local renewable resources. So those are resources that are produced in our communities, which we have control over their environmental and social impacts, rather than saying not in my backyard and just displacing the effects of our resource consumption on people who don't have the privilege to say that. And those resources, when they finally make their way to you, may have been produced with social and ecological side effects that you wouldn't be comfortable with in your community. And so there's this thing where, forest management makes a lot of people really uncomfortable, but thinking about if this is something that we need to do to build a better world is really think critically about where our resources come from. And if they're local and if they're renewable and if they make us uncomfortable, isn't that better than having no idea where they come from, and potentially having all of these other impacts? And I can get more into that, but I won't get too far into the weeds. But I think that, it's really important to protect our communities and the unique ecology that we have here. But it's also really, really, really important that we broaden our focus and that we really think about how we're affecting the world with our resource consumption, especially. And doing, something that's a little bit uncomfortable here may be the lesser of two evils, if it means protecting an ecosystem, protecting a people somewhere else in the world. So here's a few resources that are really great. These are all by, I was realizing this as I was putting this together, these are all by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro. They're just really good at, Tony's just like an amazing resource to our community here in Vermont. He's at UVM. And both Tony and Paul are just like so good at distilling really complex concepts into simple and understandable language. And so that's why I love recommending those resources to other people. And so I guess with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and would love to take all of your questions. And I think I might have, I like basically did that in 30 minutes. Wow. There's so much more to all that stuff. So please feel free to ask me.
Where is raise hand?
Marty, you can go ahead with your question. Or anyone else, feel free to unmute and question away.
Hi. Thank you so much, Ethan. That was terrific. You are a gift to the area. Thank you. Just get a little while you're with us. I wanted to ask you if you could tonight give us some context on the difference between ag land, like say pasture, and forest land, just so we can have that context in terms of the carbon aspect of it all, sequestration and storage, because of course our Champlain Valley, which is going to be our work area, is just, a very, very widely used for agriculture. So this is going to be our challenge. And of course, we're very interested in young forests and riparian forests and core forests, but I think we all want to learn more. If you can help us, it'd be terrific, about the difference between the two, and so we can have that sort of foundation information as we go about doing this launch.
So you mean the difference between the two in their ability to sequester and store carbon, or
Yeah.
the difference? Okay, so
Yeah.
I don't know the numbers off the top of my head of
Okay.
forest sequesters stores this much exactly, and
Yeah.
pasture sequesters and store this much, but I do know that there's a lot of good energy in our agricultural community for trying to sequester and store more carbon. In
Yeah.
agriculture in the course of the stuff they do, and everything. So this is, forests are going to sequester and store more carbon. However,
Okay.
every landscape that's not a forest, everything that's not a forest on our landscape is a compromise, because Vermont was pretty much completely forested prior to European colonization. So stuff that's not forest, whether it's houses or roads or agricultural fields, are almost all on the site of a clear-cut forest or a drained wetland. So those are compromises that we make for important stuff. So like, we want to grow food, we need to eat food, and so we're not sequestering the maximum amount of carbon on those acres, because we're saying, okay, this is a compromise that we're willing to make in order to provide these other values that we care about, or we need to live in a house. And so I'm going to, say, okay, I'm not going to sequester and store carbon on the footprint of this house, et cetera. So like it would be better from a carbon perspective. It would have the potential to sequester and store more carbon through, if those areas were forested, and especially if they were like really, like diverse old growth forests. But that said, there are massive ranges across agriculture, and I just know a little bit about it. I'm not going to put Chuck Ross on the spot, but he's on here. There's a massive range in agriculture depending on different types of agriculture, and even within a given type of agriculture, how that farmer is managing that land, massive ranges of different carbon levels that can be sequestered and stored in our agricultural systems.
Should we be going to the academic community for that kind of question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a kind of a case to be made, like looking at floodplain forests and forested wetlands versus upland forests in terms of their ability to store carbon? And, like if we're talking about needing to make choices for where we're growing food and the multiple benefits of kind of protecting floodplains, it feels like that's are there studies that are looking at the, I would imagine upland forests on less soil are not storing as, ledgy places.
Yeah,
I don't know, is that stuff gotten quantifiable?
Hey, Robert Turner, I think, is on the call. Robert, can I put you on the spot about that question?
You can, Ethan. Hi, everybody. I'm not sure I have a very definitive answer. I think, again, in terms of above ground carbon, there's probably not a huge amount of difference. And I'm not really sure about below ground carbon. It would probably be the soil component that would be the most different between a floodplain forest and an upland forest.
Yeah, there are differences in different forest types, like even different species, different climates, even differences like that graph I showed you of like the proportion of biomass that's like above, or the proportion of a forest that is like above ground versus below ground. And even different forest types, it'll be different proportions. So like an oak hardwood forest will have different proportions than like a boreal spruce fir forest or something like that. So there is a wide range of variability, but I don't know enough about the exact science to answer that question definitively. But I'll bet someone looks into it.
Ethan, sorry, briefly. I just was going to add to clarify that roughly 60% of the total carbon on a site is in the soil. So that's where I was coming from, pretty much.
Ethan, I have a follow-up question about soil.
Sure.
If 60% is in the soil, how long does that stay in the soil? because one of the challenges in agriculture is that we can sequester a lot of carbon, but we have to maintain a certain forms of stewardship in order to keep it there, or conversion from a row-till, a row crop to a pasture to achieve the greatest long-term carbon storage in the soil. So I'm wondering what the dynamic is around carbon in forest soil, how long it stays there, what causes it to release.
It depends. So largely what causes it to release is, it's going to be released over time. So as that wood is digested, especially by microbial life, it's going to get turned into carbon gas again. And ultimately that is probably the fate of like most or all carbon in the forest at some point. But we know that, one thing that really causes a lot of it to be released is like large openings can cause higher temperatures in the openings, which is going to really kickstart that microbial life, cause the digestion of that soil carbon and have it released into aerial carbon. So that's why you see, on that forest development clock that we looked at, you see very low amounts of carbon at sort of year 0, because a lot of that carbon has been digested in a large scale disturbance event. And also soil disturbance has something to do with it. So the extent to which soils are actually like torn up and disturbed also has an interplay with it. But one of the goals of managing for, avoiding those large scale disturbances is basically avoiding those higher soil temperatures, which then have an effect on the microbial life and their ability to digest that soil carbon, is my understanding of it.
So thank you, that's helpful. And it's kind of analogous in a forest sense to the challenges in ag. Do you have any sense of how long the carbon has to be in the soil profile before it gets more permanently sequestered in lower profiles of the soil?
I don't know, but Robert might.
Well, measurement is a real challenge when it comes to especially ag soils, and how deep you measure affects a lot about how one accounts for soil, especially in ag soils. I think that there's so much complexity in the chemistry that I'm not sure there's an answer to that question yet. I know there are folks at UVM that are working on it, but there's a lot of volatility in the carbon in the upper layers. There's more stability in the carbon in the lower layers. But how long it takes, I'm not sure we even know that yet.
Great, thank you.
I was reading something recently about the role that, well, there's a really cool, actually an article that Robert sent me about the role of worms, which are non-native here, and in their role in sort of like, mixing soils and transporting carbon up and down the soil profile. And also that salamanders do that they play a role in soil mixing like that, which may transport carbon from the upper layers of the soil to lower layers of soil where it can be more stable, which is pretty cool. I saw that someone named Suzanne also had a question. I know that we're just about out of time for this as well.
Okay. Hello, sorry to unmute and everything. I'm cleaning my house as I'm listening. So this is a little bit off topic, but as climate change progresses and look at the hardiness zones, and the hardiness zones across the country are moving up and up and up, how do you foresee that affecting carbon sequestration of the forests that we have today? And how will the forests adapt, and can they adapt for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't know. So on one hand, we know that more carbon in the atmosphere, that carbon is in some ways is a limiting nutrient for plants. And so more carbon actually means that they might grow faster in some cases. But of course, it's way more complex than that. And we know that forests are tremendously resilient and adaptable, but that also they're facing all these different threats, and that in some cases it may be that their ability to adapt is outstripped by the pace of climate change. So our climates have been changing, and many of the native tree species that we now have like been on this massive journey, right, where they were like up here, and then the glacier came, and then over thousands of years they were like pushed down south, and the glacier went back, was there for 95,000 years and then went back up, and then the trees came back up again. That was a pace of change that was entirely different from what we're facing right now. So, ultimately, I think that forests that are under stress are not going to be able to sequester and store as much carbon in the long term. as forests, which are not under stress. And I think that the risk of a really fast-paced changing climate is that our forests are going to be under a lot of stress. And so that's the goal. If you're sort of refocusing, instead of thinking about like stability, or instead of, thinking about keeping each one, growing each one of our individual trees to be quote unquote healthy, thinking about sort of resilience and adaptability in our systems so that they're basically have more tools in the toolkit to respond to change over time. And that will then hopefully translate to their ability to continue to mitigate climate change. But, one of the really tricky things about that, and one of the reasons why we're just like, we just want to manage for diversity in as many different ways as we can, is that we really don't know all of the different ways that's going to affect our ecosystems. And we just sort of have to like be ready for whatever shape that takes. I wish I could give you a better example, but we just don't know. Robert's mentioning NIACS. Would you put do you have a link to that, Robert, as a tool for forest landowners?
I can get one. It's the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and I only mention it because if you're a forest landowner, they have been working for years to offer tools to try and bring the climate science to the challenges of developing a climate adaptive management plan.
Yeah, and then and the last thing I wanted to say is that if you all want to check, so this type of forest management, I'm talking about ecological forest management, and managing for old growth characteristics in our forests, and managing for carbon sequestration and storage in the forest in the context of like forest management logging, is something that I and a lot of us are doing actively all the time. And if you want to check out some of the projects that I'm doing where I'm taking this approach, I have a YouTube channel where I do all these YouTube videos about it, and I write blog posts, and I do webinars, and I post all the recordings of my webinars up there. I have a project underway right now at the Andrews Community Forest in Richmond, which is trying to be an example of forest, what ecological forestry has been called is a kinder and gentler forest management. So it's still commercial forest management where we're cutting wood and we're shipping wood to markets, and it's getting made into stuff, and it's getting burned in people's wood stoves and stuff like that. But incorporated into that is also sort of this more holistic vision for all the things that we want to manage for, which local and noble resources is one, but all this other stuff, carbon sequestration and storage, wildlife habitat, climate resiliency, adaptability, ecological integrity are also a really, 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 really important objectives. So if you guys want to sort of follow along, you can.
Ethan,
Yeah.
Peter Bennett, I got to fight my way in here. Ethan's walked my land with me in Underhill a few years ago, and we talked about some of these issues, but I got to get this shot in before you end the whole session here. I toured the Jericho Forest with Bill Keaton, and he explained the whole notion of maximum sequestration through old growth. But he, nor any other forester that I've talked to, wants to come right out and say, we've got to realize that chipping a lot of wood for biomass, large-scale burning, is just not a good idea. And more and more research institutes and credentialed people who've been looking at this are coming around to agree with this. You and I may have talked about it. I'm just wondering, you didn't mention biomass tonight. I'm just wondering whether somehow there wouldn't be a way for the forestry profession to, if they believe it, and I don't know that they do. I've read Mike Snyder's comments on this. If there wouldn't be some way that they could explain to people why it's a problem, and the best example of this is when you look at McNeil Electric burning up to 30 cord of chips an hour. Think about how much clearing of the forests that involves. Then I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, that's a really complex question. Yeah, and I guess what I would say is that the best thing that I can say about that is that it's really complicated, and certainly there are examples of biomass, especially like southern biomass, being done really poorly, and the technologies are also variable. I think it can be good, and I think there are examples of it, especially in Europe, that are done really well, that are much more efficient. And if we can figure out a way to do it really well, I think it would be positive. I think it would be a way for us to generate power and heat, hopefully, because that's really the way to make it more efficient, is by co-generating power and heat. That there are ways that we could do it to be positive. And there's also all these other interactions, like markets for low-grade wood, and with the pulp markets going away, how do we cut small and unhealthy trees that there are no other markets for? There's all this other stuff associated with it, but I think the best that I can say is that it's really complicated, and that it's better than burning coal. But the extent to which it is, I just don't know enough about the science to really give you a firm answer on that.
Did you know that the pounds per million BTUs of CO2 produced from burning biomass is essentially equivalent to that from burning for 1 million BTUs of coal?
I didn't know that. No.
Check it out.
Thanks, Pete.
We need to have a long conversation sometime.
Will you call me anytime you want?
Okay.
Let's do it.
All right, well, I know Ethan has one more meeting to get to, Ethan, so I think we should let you go. Thank you so much for your presentation tonight. That was great, really informative, and I'm sure there will be follow-up emails and questions for you, because I know we didn't get to everyone, so I apologize for that.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's nice seeing so many familiar faces on this call, and thanks for inviting me to come again.
Thanks, Ethan.
Thank you.
See you soon.